old friend, IDSS friend, and good to be in this platform. Let me at the outset also thank for that welcome remarks, excellent welcome remarks by Ambassador Mukhopadhyay. Actually, he has set the ball rolling in some ways, that he has said everything what I wanted to say in such a short time. And my task has actually been very easy in a way, because his 2 points, 2 key points are key to my presentation. He has said in his presentation that the pandemic, the COVID-19 has actually been a earth-shaking event. And second point, which really has been highlighted in his speech, is that that the communist will come back. At some point, once the pandemic episode is over, the communist will come back. And I think these 2 points are the key if we're trying to discuss the Chinese perspective role in Indo-Pacific, how the Chinese are going to see the Indo-Pacific as their regions. We need to have a backgrounder of these 2 critical points. But again, I think I'll start with a backgrounder by saying that even though today we are talking about China's prospective role in Indo-Pacific, how the Chinese are going to look at Indo-Pacific in future, one critical point we need to keep it in mind, that even though we are talking about the present context and a future context, we don't necessarily have to make a departure from the past corollary. We don't have to make a departure from the developments that has taken place over the last 2 decades, because that's the critical juncture. That has been the critical juncture to the episode of Indo-Pacific. Indo-Pacific has arrived today because of China's rise. Indo-Pacific has arrived today because of the collective interest that most of the like-minded countries holding with each other. And therefore, it is important to keep those backgrounder, those development of the past as a past corollary, as a backgrounder. We need to really take a strong note of that. But again, if we try to understand in the present context and in the future context, China's approach to Indo-Pacific, there are 2 specific aspects we need to keep it in mind. One, who is the real power that the Chinese are actually competing with? Of course, I think it's anybody's call, but it's a fundamental thing to say that is the United States of America, with whom the Chinese are really competing in the region. The second is what for the Chinese are trying to influence their operations, their agenda in the Indo-Pacific. It is for their path to power. It is for China's rise, which is not really a complete episode yet. And I think if we talk about China's rise, it has been actually left in a very midway. If we take that past trajectory from Deng Xiaoping's time, from poor modernization's time, today they are in a very critical juncture, and the COVID-19 has actually shaken the Chinese world, China's rise in such a way that their prospects of 2021, 2027, 2035, and 2049 looks very, very doubtful. And there is a critical analysis within China which is going on if China's rise is really sustainable or not. But again, I would not really go for China's rise here, because the topic which has been given is about China's perspective on Indo-Pacific. I have already lost 2 to 3 minutes, so I have 5 critical points to share with all of you. My first point is that what is the current China's perception towards Indo-Pacific? And I think that is the critical point we need to really talk about. And in my assessment, I have written partly in some other forum, and a couple of my future publications are on these aspects. And I would encourage you to look at my commentary, which is published on China and Quad in the PACNet, in the Pacific Forum commentary section, sometime back, a couple of months back. The first point that needs to be mentioned, needs to be taken into note, is that China's current perception of Indo-Pacific is very much structural. It is not country specific. It might appear to be meant towards US, towards a set of countries, to India, but it is much more structured. If you see the Chinese response in 2002, 2003, and from that time onwards, they have been continuously talking about how the Americans are trying to uphold the unilateral nature of the make the world to remain as unipolar under their leadership, And it is that kind of response perception the Chinese hold. So the Chinese perception towards Indo-Pacific, the current perception and the future perception is going to continue to be remain as structural. The second perception I hold currently with regard to China and its future aspects towards Indo-Pacific is that its perception is much more revisionist in some ways. One of my research article is coming in Journal of Contemporary China, which is a SSCI-based journal from University of Denver. We see the China's past trajectory. What they are trying to do, they are trying to bring structural changes. They are also trying to change the status quo of the regions. How they are trying to change the status quo? They are trying to build new ports, stationing points, naval bases across the Indian Ocean regions, and all in AIIB to other institutions. They are trying to demand for a reform in IMF, WTO, World Bank for a long time. So all of this demand and all of these perceptions are going to continue in post-pandemic period. The third point, which I hold with regard to the China's current perception towards Indo-Pacific, is that it is based on a power partner contention. There are a set of countries with whom the Chinese wants to really establish a partnership, as well as they do see them as a contending power. For example, India. With India, we do have a strong partnership with the China when it comes to AIIB, when it comes to New Development Bank, but at the same time, we are a competing power. As Ambassador Mukhopadhyay pointed out and Chair Dr. Mailwingham pointed out, Quad Plus. There is nothing called, as of now, there is nothing officially called as Quad Plus. But yes, if we take into account the recent developments of the foreign secretary level meetings and foreign ministers level meeting, there is a debate which is coming up that we are moving probably towards a Quad Plus scenario. But again, we need to be realistic about this Quad Plus proposition. Before we really talk about Quad Plus proposition, has really her. Second, to what extent the Quad has actually acted in terms of balancing the Chinese outreach in the regions. I have already argued about this in my few publications. Quad is never a counter initiative to China, and it is never going to be a counter initiative. If anything, Quad is a balancing initiative. It only wants to probably balance out the Chinese initiatives in terms of infrastructure building to cooperate in the maritime domains, but it is never going to counter. So let's be very clear, Quad will never emerge as a counter initiatives. So therefore, if we're talking about Quad Plus initiatives, we need to talk about who are the countries that could be clubbed under the Quad Plus proposition, and the countries which have been invited in the foreign secretary level meeting and the foreign minister level. In the foreign secretary level, we have New Zealand, Vietnam, and South Korea. In foreign ministers level, we have South Korea, Brazil, and Israel. Now, all of these countries are not really, China friendly in today's context. But if you see their past trajectory, except probably Israel, all of these countries, including South Korea, New Zealand, Vietnam, and Brazil, which is a part of the actually BRICS process, they are strongly connected with China. So let's not really jump into the conclusion by saying that the Quad Plus has arrived. The Chinese are very much strongly linked with this set of countries. So therefore, is Quad Plus is really possible? I think it's possible, but on a soft networks. And I think there I would again take something from the welcome remarks that Ambassador Mukhopadhyay said, is that I think this is a golden opportunity for India. We need to really build our relationship further. The third point is that in my presentation is that how is really China taking advantage of the current situation in Indo-Pacific vis-a-vis the COVID-19. And I think there are 2 points which have been already mentioned partially. One is that we do see, generally I'm saying is that we do see a mixture of aggressive and a soft diplomacy from the Chinese. Aggressive diplomacy, it talks about one thing, that is the wolf warrior diplomacy that is being written all over the world by many experts. What this wolf warrior diplomacy is all about? It's a departure in Chinese diplomacy from the past practice. they're using Twitter, they're using internet and videos to articulate aggressively about China's position, about China's approach. And that's something we have not really seen from coming from the officials of China. So there is a departure in the Chinese foreign policy and diplomatic practice. The second is a kind of a soft power diplomacy, mask diplomacy. What we are seeing, the Chinese are trying to expedite their Belt and Road initiatives, supplying the masks, the medical equipments throughout the world. So they are too looking at COVID-19 as an opportunistic phase. So therefore, I would again reiterate that point that let's not write up the communists, they will come back strongly in the post-pandemic phase. The last 2 points. The fourth point here is that can Quad really emerge as an anti-China proposition, and can we really develop a anti-China phenomena out of Quad? I mean, it is one thing to say that Quad is going to expand further, we can cooperate on the maritime domain, and there is a connection of interest it can be built on, but then let's be very practical. If we today talk about the Indo-Pacific region or the world politics in general, there are almost 100 banks, international banks in the world. 19 of those 100 banks, they are having headquarters in China. And their collective assets, if we take into account, is roughly 26 trillion US dollar. So how we are going to, talk about cooperating without China in a post-COVID world? So the global economy will be very much dependent on the Chinese economy. If we take into foreign-owned banks in China, HSBC, which is a Hong Kong-based bank, it has its head of, branches inside China. Standard Chartered Bank has its own branch in China. Citibank has its own branch in China. Today, AIIB, ASEAN Infrastructure Investment Bank, has 102 members. Of course, 21 are prospective members, but altogether, if we take into account 102 members, are all of these countries going to withdraw from AIIB? No. So definitely, we are going to live in a post-COVID world where the Chinese will come back, and there is a necessity, and there is no other way out except engaging with the Chinese economy and the Chinese world. My last point here is that what all of this implies to India and India's foreign policy. Of course, this is again open to discussion. I'll happy to take few questions. But again, I think it is a very good phase currently, even though we do take into account the grave situation that has arrived due to the pandemic. It is an opportunistic situation in terms of building partnership. Of course, everybody would like to argue that it is a golden phase to improve relations with US, Japan, Australia, particularly the Quad associated countries. But I do argue differently. And I think while US, Japan, Australia are critical to Indian foreign policy, we should not miss out the point that this is the phase where we need to reassess our relationship with ASEAN. We need to reframe our relationship with with a range of institutions. For example, in IORA, Indian Ocean Rim Association, in ASEAN, in other global bodies, particularly in UN affiliated bodies, also including countries in Middle East and also in African regions. Recently, we have made it to the Indian Ocean Commission as an observer member. I think the attempt here is to take a lead in terms of framing an alternative supply chain networks, which India can actually to some extent take a lead, even though what we are getting right now, the message that all of those companies who are withdrawing from China, though the number of companies are still very minimal in nature, they are not very big in number, but most of these companies are going to Vietnam. Most of the countries are going to other countries. Can India really tap these countries? And can India really take a leadership position in terms of building a supply chain networks? These are the critical questions we need to talk about in a post-COVID world, which actually leaves a lot of opportunities for India. And one final point is that I think with regard to Southeast Asia, which is critical to India's Indo-Pacific formulation and outlook, is that of course, it looks like probably we won't be immediately returning back to RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. But then we need to really find out how to engage with the same set of economies in the ASEAN regions, with the ASEAN dialogue partners, including Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and other countries, including South Korea. South Korea has been, called for foreign secretary level meeting and foreign minister level framework that media is talking about. So we need to really talk about how to actually build a much more concentrative economic engagement in terms of in a multilateral platform with these set of countries and these set of institutions. And I think I'll stop here and take some of your questions during